The value gap is the belief that white people are valued more than others. And this belief isn't the possession of loud racists, people running around with white sheets over their heads or swastikas tattooed on parts of their body. Rather, this belief animates our social practices, our political arrangements, and our economic realities. This belief that white people matter more than others distorts our characters and deform our democracy.
What's up, YouTube family? Welcome back to my space. This is Even Srayola. Guys, on today's video, we want to talk about racism. You notice people have been talking about racism for years and nothing has been changing in the black communities in America. And guys, on today's video, I found this powerful speech, by the Professor A.D. Glaude Jr., who's very vocal in the issues of racism. And in this video, he tries, to try and expand the minds of black folks living in the US. He tries to condemn the rot of racism. So guys, A.D. Glaude Jr. is a prominent scholar and professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. He has been vocal about racism in America. His perspective emphasizes that racism is deeply embedded in American institutions, cultures, and history. He argues that addressing racism requires more than just acknowledging individual prejudice. It demands a fundamental reckoning within the country's past and present. So guys, I wanted to watch this video of Professor A.D. Glaude talking openly about racism, Once the video is done, we will get back and do a critical analysis about the same. Let's watch this together, guys.
We live in a society where we can tell ourselves that we've turned an economic corner, that we have come out of the Great Recession. And when you look at black and brown communities in this country, when you turn your attention to those who are not, quote unquote, one of you, what do we see? We don't see a community that's come out of depression or come out of economic recession. We see a community struggling to make ends meet, right? I interviewed a young woman by the name of Christine Frazier. I write about this in the book. And Christine played by the rules, did everything right? Her husband died. She lost her job and she couldn't make ends meet. She couldn't pay her house note. And the sheriff's office came in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning, and they unlocked the door and they told her and her mother and her daughter and her grandson to get out, and they proceeded to empty the house of a lifetime worth of memories, to put all of it in the yard. She said, they came into my home like I was a drug dealer, but they knew that dogs were there. And she said they told her they didn't have any place for her to go. And they said to her, you have to figure out what you're going to do. But they knew dogs were there. So they called animal shelter. And she said the pain of losing the house was one thing. But they came with the place for my dog. We live in a country, where we can talk about turning a corner, but there are people right in our midst, who are struggling to make ends meet, people who are working hard, who are honest, who are trying to make ends meet, but we disremember, we think it's their fault. So in the book, I talk about the Great Black Depression. I talk about the fact that black folk lost their homes, over 240,000 homes lost as a result of the collapse of the housing market. I talk about, the fact that over 38%, 40% of black children are growing up in poverty. I talk about the downward mobility as African Americans experience the loss of incomes, the inability to dream big dreams for their children because they can't make ends meet. And we live in a country that says we've turned the corner. But let me say this really quickly. Y'all all right? I don't know why you invited me here. I'm going to tell the truth. I'm going to tell the truth. In my mind, democracies require particular kinds of dispositions to work. But something has distorted and disfigured our national and individual character. Remember, I said there's a crisis of imagination. Imagination involves what? Not only just simply the fantastical and the creative, the imagination involves what? This ability, to see oneself put oneself in the position of another, that has something to do with our characters. I want to say that something has distorted and disfigured who we take ourselves to be, and I call it the value gap. Now I'm about to get into the substance of it, taking my watch off, right? What is the value gap? The value gap is the belief that white people are valued more than others. Oh, I'm going to say it again. The value gap is the belief that white people are valued more than others. And this belief isn't the possession of loud racists, people running around with white sheets over their heads or swastikas tattooed on parts of their body. Rather, this belief animates our social practices, our political arrangements, and our economic realities. This belief that white people matter more than others distorts our characters and deform our democracy. I like to tell the story of my father, who was the second African-American hired at the post office in Pascagoula, Mississippi, the place where William Faulkner honeymooned. And back then, getting hired at the post office was high cotton, right? And so he knew he had precocious kids, so he decided to move us from the east side of Moss Point to the west side, on a hill, Briarwood Circle. And as we were moving into that house, I'm playing with my Tonka truck. You remember those old Tonka trucks? I'm playing with my Tonka dump truck, and I'm making my dump truck noises, and all of a sudden I hear an adult say, "Stop playing with that nigga." And it's the first time I had been called that word in that context. So I grabbed my truck and I took it inside and I took it to my father who doesn't suffer white people easily. Right? Ran outside and he did whatever he did. But that's how we typically tell the story of American racism, right? Some black family achieves the American dream. They move to a big house on a hill, and then some child is wounded by some mean-spirited adult who calls them the N-word, and then that child has to work all of her life to prove that she's not that. But that's too easy. It's too melodramatic. It's too all my children-like. My mother's favorite soap opera. Because I already knew at the age of 8 and 9 years old that we were moving from the black side of town to the white side of town. I already knew because Rose Drive, where we used to live, because the pipes are bad, every time it rained, it flooded. I already knew because the sidewalks weren't paved like they were on the west side. The baseball diamond wasn't cut as regularly as it was on the other side. The houses were smaller. The schools weren't as financed. The town, that side of town was subject to layoffs by Ingalls, the shipyard, paper mill. I already knew in the very built environment that something said that those folk over there were less valued than those folk over here. We want to look for the bad racist. Right? The obvious racist, but we are making choices day in and day out, right, that sustain racial inequality in this country. My colleague Imani Perry calls it a cultural practice of inequality. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I believe the planet is actually getting warmer. All right, you feel me? It's hottest summer on record, hottest year on record. But if you look at my house, and you look at my car, and you look at my light bulbs, you look at the way I live my life, the daily choices I make, you would think I believe the planet was all right. My day-to-day behavior suggests that I'm a climate change denier. So there are folks running around here who are saying that they are committed to racial equality, but their choices. I just want my kids to go to the best schools. The social sciences have already said that whenever you hear that phrase, it's usually a proxy for how many black and brown kids attend my school. I want my neighborhood to be safe. We know what that means. I want my property values to stay. We know what that means. Right? So it's in the kind of water, the cultural practice, the value gap is evidenced. Let me give you a quote from James Baldwin in The Uses of the Blues. Y'all all right? Baldwin clearly states what he takes to be the Negro problem. I'm talking about what happens to you If you've barely escaped suicide or death or madness or yourself, you watch your children growing up, and no matter what you do, you are powerless. You are really powerless against the force of the world that is out to tell your child that he has no right to be alive, and no amount of liberal jargon, no amount of talking about how well and how far we have progressed does anything to soften or to point out any solution to this dilemma. In every generation, ever since Negroes have been here, Baldwin writes, every Negro mother and father has had to face that child and try to create in that child some way of surviving this particular world. Some way to make the child who will be despised not despise himself. I don't know what the Negro problem means to white people, Baldwin writes, but this is what it means to the Negro. What does it mean to try to construct an idea of the self in a country that is organized in every single way on the basis, on the grounds of the value gap? Not because people are mean-spirited, but it's because it's in the very DNA of the country. And this is what makes addressing the problem, I'm leaving my notes now. This is what makes addressing the problem of white supremacy, of racial inequality in this country so difficult, because we refuse to look the ugliness of who we are squarely in the face and dare to imagine ourselves differently. This is hard work. This is hard. The value gap isn't sustained by loud racists. The value gap is sustained by all of us. All of us. You don't need white people for white supremacy to work. When I'm in New Jersey and I'm driving down Stuyvesant Avenue in Trenton, I hold a set of generalizations about the people who occupy that particular neighborhood. It's known as Little Iraq. I keep my head on a swivel. Right? There's a kind of particular fear that gets generalized, is generalized to an entire population, that informs a set of assumptions about how I interact with them. And those generalizations have policy implications. We are socialized and habituated into believing, right, certain things about certain folks. Right? I write about this in the text. Nancy DeTomaso at Rutgers, a social scientist, she did a series of interviews of white working class folk in Cleveland, in Ohio, and in Tennessee, and in Jersey, I believe. And she said she was interviewing these workers, and one worker said, I'm sorry, black people are just lazy. They just want a handout. You've heard this before. It's been informing public discourse since I can remember remembering. And they don't want to work hard for anything. And it turned out that his father was close friends with the union boss who hooked him up with a job. Another interviewer, right? I'm sorry to say, they're just lazy. They don't want to work. It turns out that not only his friend gave him the test that he needed to take for his job, gave him the answers to the test. And what Nancy's trying to suggest in this moment is, right, not that there is some, right, overt racism that's happening. People are just hooking up their friends and families, right? That it's what she calls opportunity hoarding, that racial inequality actually is perpetuated through social networks, right? And because we're so deeply a segregated society, our social networks are typically, 75% of our social networks are 100% homogeneous. So opportunities pass through certain networks that do not pass through others. Right? I'm just helping out my child. I'm not being racist. Right? I'm just helping out my neighbor. I'm not being racist. I said something jokingly to a friend the other night. I said, if we want to solve black-on-black crime in the United States, we just need to integrate neighborhoods. And they didn't quite get it. I said, some of you didn't get it either, right? Most crime takes place, right, because of proximity. White on white crime, 83% of crime that happens in white communities happens between white and unwhite people. 91% happens because our neighborhoods are segregated. If we all move together, then we'll just be criminal with each other. I don't know. Racial habits. The value gap distorts who we take ourselves to be. It blocks the way to the formation of the kinds of people democracies require. I was just talking about, with Reverend Hart Anderson, about Abraham Lincoln's rejection of the monstrous injustice of slavery, but his commitment to the belief that white people were superior than black people. And how those commitments blocked the way from him becoming the kind of human being his idea of democracy required. What does it mean in our country that we can hold the ideals of democracy, and when those ideals are extended to black and brown people, we are willing to erode the social safety net? Right? Welfare, for much of the New Deal, right, was in fact a project of Southern Dixiecrats aimed at addressing poor white Southerners. But the moment the face of the welfare state became black, as my colleague Martin Gillens writes, it became, right, an emblem of the problem with big government. What happens when we're willing to turn our backs on an idea, a robust idea of the public good, because it involves people who are not like us? It means that we're willing to throw democracy into the trash bin over the idea, over our commitment to the idea that some people, because of the color of their skin, are valued more than others. The value gap is at the heart of our problem. The value gap is evidenced in our habits of living, habits that define where we live, where we work. I can't begin to tell you how often I have to leave the particularity of my experience at the door in order to make white people comfortable. It's almost as if, as James Baldwin writes in Notes of a Native Son, we have to make ourselves blank in order to wash away your guilt. And so we dance this dance, America's racial theater. It's this dance so that you can't be called a racist and I can't trigger your fears. Huh? The worst thing that you can be called is a racist, even though everything that's coming out of your mouth, Donald Trump suggests otherwise. Right? We find ourselves in this dance, unwilling to confront the ugliness of who we are. Just think about this. The last piece of great legislation passed in the Great Society was the 1968 Fair Housing Act. I'm watching my time. 12 years later, Ronald Reagan is elected. 12 years later, there is the triumph of a political ideology designed to undo the Great Society and the New Deal. Did we fix the country in 12 years? 1965, the Voting Rights Act, right? By 1980, wholesale attack. We don't need to protect them anymore, right? Shelby, we don't need to do it. And what happens after the Shelby decision recently, right? We get a proliferation of attacks on voter registration, voter IDs, right? Think about it. At every turn, at every moment of progress in this country, we have seen a reassertion of the value gap. At the moment in which we give voice to the principles of liberty and equality, right, in the context of the American Revolution, what do we get in response? We reconcile those principles with racial slavery. John Adams, it is said to King George, "We will not be your Negroes." At the very moment in which he's giving voice to an idea of freedom is predicated upon an intimate understanding of unfreedom, a reassertion of the value gap. In the moment of radical reconstruction, we offer, right, a vision of multiracial democracy. What do we get in response to radical reconstruction? We get convict leasing, right? Convict leasing. You wouldn't have the city of Birmingham without the labor, the forced labor of convicts, quote unquote. People arrested for what reason? Right? Slavery by another name, as Brother Blackman talked. And you get Jim Crow and a reassertion of the value gap. In the context, right, of the black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century, everyday ordinary people demanding dignity and standing. What do we get in response? We get the tax revolt in Northern California. And we get calls for law and order. Value gap. What do we get when we elect our first black president and we think we turned the corner? We get the vitriol of the Tea Party. And we get a wholesale attack, right, on the voting rights of black and brown peoples. At every turn, at every moment of progress, we that progress is arrested by a reassertion of the value gap. We have to do the work, but we're afraid. We are afraid. White fear has driven this country since its founding. Think about Thomas Jefferson's notes of the state of Virginia. I'm going to come home. I'm trying to get there. Right? Think about, he said, I tremble for this country because of the sin of slavery. Right? He was afraid of what that meant, the divine punishment that would come for holding another human being in slavery. And he writes that particular formulation in the section on habit formation. Because he said, what happens to a child who witnesses the violence of slavery? Something is broken on the inside of such a child who experiences that. Something happens to their character, Jefferson suggests. But in that moment of fear, right, it drives policy. Think about, right, the fear of Abraham Lincoln in the second inaugural, supposedly the second founding. Think about the fear surrounding Black rage with the Black Panther Party. You know, that cover of the New Yorker where they had Obama dressed as a Muslim and Michelle Obama as Angela Davis. And they were bumping fists, and people were like, what does that mean? Did they bumped fists? Did the Black people just begin revolution? Fear. Fear drives policy. The moral panics around the so-called super predators, where the data suggested was not true. What did the moral panics do? It drove mass incarceration. Think about what happened with the Central Park Five. Those babies were innocent. Their lives stolen. Think about all the millions of folk who are locked up because of fear. Fear driving policy. We can no longer be afraid. And that fear actually drives our political behavior, Black political behavior. As I said earlier, we're afraid to trigger your fears. So we will grit our teeth in the moment which you say something a little off color. Our fear of triggering white fear affects our behavior. So we're masking day in and day out, walking past each other, not really seeing the humanity of the person right in front of us. No wonder we're stuck. But Malcolm X said this, and I'm going to say this in front of you guys and make you mad. I don't care. We have to stop sweet talking. Tell you how we really feel. Tell you what kind of hell we've been catching, and let you know if you don't clean up your house, if you're not ready to clean up your house, you shouldn't have a house. It should catch on fire and burn down. Now, I'm not trying to burn down anybody's house. But what Malcolm is talking about is frank speech. That we have to confront each other honestly.
Different Black scholars have tried to empower Black people in America, talking about racism, talking about discrimination that we face as a people, as the Black community. But many a times, even after all these lectures, after all these, grievances being aired outside there, it has been difficult for the white supremacists to stop racism. And it's time that most of people are trying to advocate for Black folk to be empowered in their own way, for them to be able to employ other Black people, for them to grow economically as a people, for them now to be selfish and start thinking about themselves as a race. Because for the longest time we've been taken as inferior people, we've been secluded as just other people who are not special, and it's time that we start to think about ourselves. And in today's video, I found this speech, by Professor A.D., Professor A.D. Glaude, who is a very, very vocal professor, trying to empower Black folks, against racism and discrimination in America. He says, when you look at the Black and brown communities in America, what do you see? Family, comment down below. When you look at the Black and brown communities in the US, what do you see? What comes to your mind? Are we happy with the state of Black people in America? Are we happy in the state of Black and brown people in the US? What do we see when we look at the black community? He proceeds to say, we see a community struggling to make ends meet. Then he tries to give out this scenario where he interviewed a lady known as Christine, a lady whose husband died, a black lady whose husband died. Then later she lost her work. Then after this incident, the sheriff went to her house, late in the night, told her to go outside with his family, took all her things, threw them outside, outside the compound right there. Then now they noticed this family had dogs, but now they instead called for animal shelter for the dogs. They deemed these animals special than even they could take this woman's family. That shows you the position we've been placed as a people. That black woman, in this story, Christine, was chased out of her own house because of accrued bills. But then they decided to give, the dogs better shelter. They called for animal shelter to come and pick up the dogs. While human beings are easily thrown outside, what does that show you? How are we taken as a people? Could that have happened, in a white neighborhood? Let me know in the comment section down below. Then he proceeds to say, the value gap is the belief that white people have value more than others. This belief animates our social practices, our political arrangements, and economic realities. This belief that white people matter more than others distorts our characters. There is nobody who's bigger than the other. There's no way people will have the value gap in their minds and think that white people are actually special than we are. These are some of the issues that are trying to perpetuate and continue to foster racism and discrimination in America. You can see what they did with Jesus, making, or rather trying to insinuate that Christ was a white man. That was a way that they could use this photo, this idol, to manipulate us during the days of slavery, during the days of colonialism, and it actually worked for them. I went further to do more research, in regards to this topic by Professor Eddie Glaude, and these are some of the key points from Glaude's view on racism. Number one, racism as a moral and structural problem. Glaude contends that racism is not just about individual acts of bigotry, but it's woven into American institutions. He critiques the systemic racism affects housing, education, employment, and criminal justice system. When we talk about education, we know how black people have been disadvantaged in the education center. When you look at employment, the black communities has a larger number of unemployment rate. When you look at housing, we are disadvantaged. The criminal justice system, the police force, instead of trying to protect us, they are killing our young men and women in cold blood. It's easy for a black man to be killed in the streets, than it is for a white man. Both of them having not been armed, having not causing, any threat to the police. It's easier for a black man to be gunned down. Then number two is the myth of American innocence. He often speaks about America's tendency to deny or downplay its history on racial injustice. He argues that the country avoids true accountability by maintaining a narrative of innocence. The only way you can be able to be helped, or the only way a solution can be found to a problem, is by first accepting that that problem is there. So when America feels that it's innocent when it comes to matters racial divide, that just shows us that the government is not ready to solve these issues of racism. That's why I call upon all black people, let us empower each other. That's the only way we can be a powerhouse. Number three is the James Baldwin's influence. Glaude frequently references the writer James Baldwin, especially in his book Begin Again. James Baldwin's America and its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. He uses Baldwin's insights to explore how America struggles with racial justice and its unwillingness to confront white supremacy. The America in itself doesn't want to consult white supremacy. You know, people are pretending like everything is okay. Things are not okay, man. Things are not okay. Then the white fear and backlash. He discusses how racial progress in America is often met with backlash from white communities who fear losing status or privilege. This cycle, he argues, has repeated throughout American history. I have seen different scholars trying to explain why they think that white folk, especially the white supremacists, are afraid to sit down in a setup and talk about matters racism. Most of them are uncomfortable. Most of them deem it as reverse racism. You know, we look at experiences from people like Tim Wise, Jane Elliott, the blue eye, brown eye. You know, these experiments just shows you how white folks are usually not ready, you know, when it comes to topics dealing with racism. You know, they are comfortable and they do not want to lose their status or privilege. Number 5, we have the beyond performative anti-racism. Glaude criticizes symbolic gestures that do not lead to real policy change. He argues that real racial justice requires structural reform, not just statements of solidarity or corporate diversity initiatives. Number 6 is hope and responsibility. Despite his critics, Glaude believes that change is possible if Americans collectively take responsibility for the nation's racial history and work towards justice. Guys, let me know in the comment section down below what you think of the teachings, you know, of the professor A.D. Glaude. Comment down below. Let me know what you think about this specific teaching on racism. Guys, like this video so that it can be recommended to other YouTube users, and I'll be so grateful, guys. Thank you, and see you all in my next episode. Don't forget to subscribe, guys. We are on the road to 50k subs, and guys, we can only do that by ensuring that we subscribe on the far right side of your screen. Thank you, and see you all in my next episode. Goodbye.